Audie Murphy almost never spoke harshly, except about one Hollywood legend. He said it flat out. He couldn't stand him. From a hungry Texas boy to Medal of Honor hero to reluctant movie star, Murphy lived real courage at Colmar, then walked into a town built on make-believe, where one star crossed his line of respect. This isn't gossip. It's a clash of values: service, honor, and ego. Stay with me and you'll hear who he hated and why it never cooled. If you want facts over flash, hit subscribe and tell me, is a hero measured by what he does or by the applause after? Imagine this: a skinny Texas farm boy, barely 5'5", weighing less than 120 pounds. A boy so small that the US Army initially told him to go home, that he was simply too weak, too young, too fragile for war. That boy's name was Audie Leon Murphy. By every outward measure, he was the least likely candidate to become a warrior, let alone a legend. And yet, history has a way of surprising us. That same rejected kid would go on to become the most decorated American soldier of World War II, a man whose name would forever be etched into the story of American courage. The contrast is almost cinematic. Think about it. In a war that saw millions of men, tough, strong, battle-ready, Audie Murphy, the little Texan with a baby face, would outshine them all. His journey from poor farm boy to Medal of Honor recipient isn't just a tale of battlefield heroics. It's a testament to grit, willpower, and the unshakable spirit of someone who refused to accept the limits the world tried to place on him. And if you think that's just patriotic exaggeration, let's talk about the day that defined him, the battle at the Colmar Pocket in January 1945. The Allies were grinding through winter in eastern France. Snow blanketed the ground, visibility was low, and German forces were pushing hard. Murphy, by then just 19 years old, found himself in command of fewer than 40 men, holding a critical line against an overwhelming German counterattack. Suddenly, tanks rolled into view, accompanied by waves of infantry. For most, that would be the end. The sensible choice would have been retreat, survival. But Murphy wasn't wired like that. He ordered his men to fall back into defensive positions while he stayed up front. Spotting a burning tank destroyer that had been knocked out, Murphy climbed onto its smoldering hull. Bullets cracked through the air, artillery shells thundered around him, yet he manned the mounted .50 caliber machine gun. Alone, he unleashed a storm of fire. Witnesses said he cut down wave after wave of German soldiers, holding them off for nearly an hour. Think about that. A single man, silhouetted against smoke and fire, turning back an entire assault that should have crushed his unit. When his ammunition finally ran low, instead of retreating, he calmly rejoined his men, rallied them, and led a counterattack that drove the Germans away. That day, he earned the Medal of Honor, America's highest military award. But more than a medal, he earned a place in history. Because the Colmar Pocket wasn't just about bravery. It was about defiance. A poor, undersized kid from Texas had stared down tanks, artillery, and enemy fire, and he didn't blink. It's almost impossible not to feel the weight of that image. Picture it: snow swirling, the world exploding around him, and one lone figure standing his ground. Hollywood would later dramatize war countless times, but Audie Murphy didn't need a scriptwriter. His life was the story. And that's the hook. Because here's the question that gnaws at you. How does someone like that come to be? How does a boy with no money, no education beyond the 5th grade, abandoned by his father and scarred by hardship, rise to become America's ultimate soldier? How does someone rejected for being too small end up larger than life? To understand Audie Murphy, you can't just look at the medals, the photographs, or the official citations. You have to rewind the tape, go back to the dusty cotton fields of Texas, back to the long days of hunger and the nights of uncertainty. Because it was there, in poverty, in struggle, in loss, that the foundations of this legend were built. Audie Murphy wasn't born a hero. He was forged by hardship, by pain, by necessity. And when the world went to war, all those scars and struggles became his greatest weapons. So before we dive into the chaos of battlefields and the glitz of Hollywood that would later come calling, let's first answer the question: what turned this fragile boy into the immortal soldier America still remembers today? If you really want to understand Audie Murphy the soldier, you first have to meet Audie Murphy the boy. And that means going back to the blistering heat and red dirt of rural Texas in the 1920s and 30s. He wasn't born into privilege or even comfort. He was born into poverty so deep it left scars before he ever saw a battlefield. Audie Leon Murphy came into the world on June 20th, 1925, in the small farming community of Kingston, Hunt County, Texas. He was the seventh of 12 children, a house crowded with too many mouths to feed and never enough food on the table. His parents, Emmett Barry Murphy and Josie Bell Killian, were poor tenant farmers. They worked the land, but the land never gave back enough. It was a hardscrabble life, made harder by the looming shadow of the Great Depression. Worse still, Emmett, his father, was unreliable at best. He drifted in and out of the household, sometimes gone for weeks, sometimes months, leaving Josie to carry the crushing weight of survival. By all accounts, Josie was a woman of grit. She tried to hold that large family together with nothing more than stubbornness, love, and back-breaking work. But when the man of the house vanished, it was Audie and his older siblings who had to step up. Imagine being just a child and already responsible for younger brothers and sisters. That's the world Audie lived in. School was a luxury he couldn't afford. By the 5th grade, Audie dropped out. Not because he lacked the brains. By every measure, he was sharp and quick. But because the family needed income more than they needed another diploma hanging on the wall. From that point on, his classroom was the cotton fields of Northeast Texas. Day after day, under the merciless sun, he picked cotton for pennies. His hands blistered, his back bent, and still, it wasn't enough. He tried odd jobs, farmhand work, clerical tasks in small towns, anything that put a few coins in his pocket. For Audie, childhood was never about play. It was about survival. But the hardest blow came in 1941. Josie, his mother, and the only true anchor in his turbulent world, died. Audie was just 16. Her death shattered the fragile stability of the Murphy family. With their father long gone, the children had nowhere to turn. Some were placed in orphanages, others in foster care. The siblings were scattered like seeds in the wind, each forced to grow up alone. Audie, especially close to his mother, took the loss like a deep wound he would carry forever. He would later say that he fought his entire life with the image of his mother in his heart, that she had been his moral compass, even after she was gone. Now orphaned in all but name, Audie drifted through the small towns of Farmersville, Greenville, and Celeste, taking whatever work he could find. He was a teenager, but in reality he was already a man hardened by necessity. While other boys his age worried about dances or baseball games, Audie worried about keeping food in his stomach. Those lean years sharpened something inside him, a resilience, an independence, a refusal to quit, traits that would later serve him in combat far more than any boot camp ever could. There's a saying, hard times create strong men. Audie Murphy was living proof. He wasn't sculpted in a gym or trained in elite academies. He was shaped by hunger, abandonment, and the kind of loss that either breaks you or builds you. For him, it did both. It broke his childhood but built his will. And yet, despite the pain, there was also a kind of fire. By the time the United States was inching closer to war, Audie saw an opportunity, a way out. Not just for himself, but for his broken family. Military service, he thought, could mean steady pay, a roof over his head, maybe even a chance to pull his siblings back together someday. But deeper than that, war offered him a chance to prove something, to himself and to a world that had always looked down on the poor farm boy. It's tempting to see Audie Murphy as destined for greatness, but in truth, his path was anything but certain. He could easily have become another forgotten name, another casualty of poverty swallowed up by the Depression-era South. What saved him wasn't luck. It was his refusal to lie down. Every day of his youth had been a battle, and though the enemies back then were hunger, loss, and hardship, those battles had trained him for the ones he was about to face on foreign soil. By 1942, with America fully committed to World War II, Audie was just 17 and desperate to enlist. He saw the army as his ticket out, his shot at redemption, his chance to trade cotton fields for battlefields. He was still that small boy with the baby face, but inside, he carried scars no recruiter could see. And those scars, forged in the Texas sun and the shadow of poverty, were about to become his greatest strength. Because the truth is, heroes aren't born, they're made. And Audie Murphy had been in training his whole life, not in classrooms or gymnasiums, but in the crucible of survival. The army didn't know it yet, but when they finally accepted him, they weren't just getting another recruit. They were unleashing a survivor, someone who had already stared down hunger, abandonment, and despair, and won. By the summer of 1942, the world was engulfed in flames. Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe. Japan was expanding across the Pacific, and America had thrown itself into a war that would decide the future of civilization. For a boy from Farmersville, Texas, this was more than history unfolding on the radio. It was a personal call. Audie Murphy, now 17, had already buried his mother, watched his siblings scattered into orphanages, and carried the weight of survival on his thin shoulders. To him, the army wasn't just duty, it was escape. It was purpose. It was the one chance to rewrite his life. But there was a catch. At 5'5" and barely 112 pounds, Murphy looked like someone who belonged behind a school desk, not carrying a rifle. The Marines rejected him. The Navy laughed him off. Even the paratroopers, who prided themselves on toughness, said no. But rejection was nothing new to Murphy. His entire childhood had been a string of closed doors and uphill battles. So he kept showing up, knocking again and again until the army finally gave in. On June 30th, 1942, the runt from Texas officially became a U.S. Army infantryman. Boot camp was merciless. Recruits twice his size mocked him, calling him babyface and betting he wouldn't last a week. Yet Murphy had a secret weapon, an iron will forged in Texas cotton fields and sharpened by years of hunger. He ran until his lungs burned, marched until blisters tore his feet raw, and shot with a deadly precision born from hunting squirrels to feed his siblings. Slowly, the laughter faded. In its place came something else: respect. Signed to the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, Murphy shipped out to North Africa. War in the desert wasn't glamorous. It was heat stroke, dysentery, and endless sand. But Murphy never wavered. He kept his head down, followed orders, and proved himself reliable under pressure. By the time his unit landed in Sicily in 1943, he was no longer just the kid from Texas. He was a soldier. Sicily changed everything. Under relentless machine gun fire, Murphy's quiet bravery began to shine. He didn't panic, he didn't freeze, he fought. Crawling through dust, firing with pinpoint accuracy, pulling wounded comrades to safety, Murphy's name started spreading through the ranks. When the campaign ended, he wore the stripes of a corporal. But it was in southern France, during Operation Dragoon, August 1944, that Audie Murphy's legend truly began. German forces defended the coastline fiercely, and chaos reigned as Allied troops tried to push inland. Murphy refused to let fear dictate his actions. In one firefight, he seized an abandoned machine gun and raked enemy lines with devastating precision, holding ground until reinforcements arrived. That moment of raw courage earned him the promotion to second lieutenant, a meteoric rise for someone who had been mocked as too small to serve. From then on, Murphy's war record read like something out of a Hollywood script. Time after time, he placed himself between his men and certain death. He crawled through gunfire to drag buddies out of ambushes. He charged enemy nests when ammunition was running dry. He absorbed shrapnel and bullets, then got up and fought again. His jacket grew heavy with medals, silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts, each one a reminder that this undersized Texan had the kind of courage most men only dreamed of. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany, Murphy had become a living symbol of American grit. Officers trusted his instincts. Soldiers followed him without hesitation. His size no longer mattered. What mattered was that in every desperate moment, he stood tall. And yet, to Murphy, heroism was never about glory. He didn't fight for medals or headlines. He fought for the men beside him, for the brothers who counted on him to bring them home. "You don't think about being brave," he later said. "You just don't have a choice." That sense of duty, that relentless refusal to break, would soon carry him into the winter of 1945, to a battlefield where his courage would reach mythic proportions. But even before Colmar, Murphy had already proven the truth. You didn't need to be big to fight like a giant. By early 1945, Audie Murphy had already proven himself countless times, but in the frozen Colmar Pocket, his courage became legendary. Alone, wounded, and outgunned, he mounted a burning tank destroyer and turned its heavy machine gun on advancing German troops. For over an hour, he held the line, refusing to yield. That stand earned him the Medal of Honor and secured his place in history. When the war finally ended, Murphy carried with him not just 33 decorations, but scars, physical and invisible. He was only 20 years old, yet he had lived a lifetime of violence and loss. Friends were gone, wounds ached, and sleep came only in fragments. Back home, the battle continued in quieter ways. Murphy wrestled with what we now call PTSD. He kept a pistol under his pillow, woke drenched in sweat from nightmares, and fought bouts of depression. But instead of hiding, he spoke out, giving voice to thousands of veterans who shared the same struggle but lacked his platform. Even as he served in the Texas National Guard, Murphy found a new stage in Hollywood. His war memoir became the blockbuster film To Hell and Back, 1955, where he played himself. Audiences were riveted, not by a polished actor, but by a man who had truly lived the story. Over the next decade, he starred in dozens of westerns and action films, building a second career that kept his name alive. Yet off-screen, he never let the spotlight erase his advocacy. He pressed for better care for veterans, warning America not to forget those who carried invisible wounds. Audie Murphy's legacy is not only measured in medals or movie posters, it lies in the journey of a frail Texas farm boy who defied every rejection, stood unshaken in the face of war, and never stopped fighting for those beside him. His story proves that true greatness is born from resilience, not size. Fame, however, never lifted the burden of memory. Murphy often said the real heroes were the ones who never came home, and he carried their absence like a shadow. Behind every smile for the cameras lay the weight of comrades lost, a reminder that survival itself came with a cost. Even so, he refused to retreat into silence. Murphy used his platform to speak out for veterans at a time when few acknowledged the hidden wounds of war. His candor gave voice to thousands of soldiers who shared his struggle, but lacked his courage to admit it. In that way, his service never truly ended, it transformed. On screen, he became a symbol all over again. Hollywood cast him in more than 40 films, mostly westerns, where audiences saw not just an actor but a man who had faced death and lived to tell the tale. His presence carried an authenticity no script could fake, and it kept his legend alive for a new generation. Audie Murphy's story is more than medals, battles, or movies. It is the arc of a boy who should have been overlooked, yet refused to be. A boy who became a soldier who became a legend, and a legend who never stopped fighting. For his men, for his country, and for every veteran who came after him. His life reminds us that true greatness lies not in size or strength, but in the will to endure, to lead, and to never give up. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, Audie Murphy did not return as just another veteran. He came home as a living symbol. A frail Texas farm boy once rejected at the recruiting station who had become the most decorated American soldier in history. Barely in his 20s, his face was splashed across the covers of Life and Time. Reporters swarmed him, eager to understand how someone so unlikely could become a national hero. In post-war America, people longed for figures to believe in. Murphy, with his modest smile and steady gaze, embodied courage without arrogance. He reminded the country that greatness could come from the most ordinary beginnings, and that struck a deep chord with a nation still grieving its losses. Hollywood quickly came calling. Studios saw in him something no actor could fake: authenticity. At first, Murphy resisted. He dreamed of a quiet life on a ranch, far from cameras and crowds. But Universal Pictures was persistent, and in 1948, he stepped in front of the movie lights for the first time. The transition was far from smooth. Shy by nature and lacking formal training, Murphy often looked stiff beside Hollywood elites. Critics were unimpressed, yet audiences sensed something real. When he shouldered a rifle on screen or looked into the camera with haunted eyes, they believed him. He didn't have to act. He had lived it. In the early 1950s, Murphy cut his teeth in westerns and modest war dramas. Films like Bad Boy 1949, The Kid from Texas 1950, and Kansas Raiders 1950 gave him room to grow. He was often cast as the reluctant hero or the outlaw, a reflection of his own contradictions, humble yet hardened, quiet yet dangerous when provoked. Slowly, his presence began to draw audiences. Then came the turning point, To Hell and Back 1955, based on his best-selling memoir. Universal made a bold gamble, asking Murphy to play himself and relive the battles that had nearly killed him. At first, he hesitated, torn by the pain of memory, but finally agreed, believing it would honor the comrades who never came home. The result was electric. The film stunned audiences, not as fiction, but as living history. When Murphy charged through smoke or collapsed from exhaustion, viewers knew they weren't watching make-believe. They were watching a man relive his own war. To Hell and Back shattered box office records, becoming Universal's top-grossing film for nearly 2 decades and cemented Murphy's place in Hollywood. Yet Murphy never let the spotlight define him. Off-screen, he remained the same modest soldier from Texas, wary of fame and quick to credit others. He also continued to write, and his memoir, praised for its raw honesty, became a touchstone for veterans. In its pages, many found the words they themselves could not speak aloud: fear, grief, and the fragile humanity of men in combat. Through his films and writing, Murphy gave post-war America more than entertainment. He provided a bridge between the battlefield and the home front, a way for civilians to glimpse what soldiers had endured. That authenticity became his hallmark, setting him apart from the polished idols of Hollywood. Still, Murphy's battles did not end when the credits rolled. Like many veterans, he carried the war inside him. Nightmares stalked his sleep, sudden noises jolted him to the edge of violence, and he kept a pistol under his pillow long after the shooting stopped. Today we would call it PTSD. Back then, it was dismissed as battle fatigue. Those scars spilled into his personal life. In 1949, Murphy married rising actress Wanda Hendricks. To the outside world, it looked like a Hollywood fairy tale. But behind closed doors, the war intruded. His paranoia and sudden outbursts shook their marriage. Within 2 years, it collapsed, a painful reminder that even heroes could not simply leave the war behind. Later that same year, Murphy remarried, this time to Pamela Archer, a flight attendant with no ties to Hollywood. Patient and steady, Pamela gave him the grounding he desperately needed. Together, they raised 2 sons, Terry and James. Fatherhood offered Murphy rare moments of peace, glimpses of the simple life he had once longed for. Yet even with family, the battle inside never fully ceased. He admitted to bouts of depression, gambling to dull the pain, and a temper that sometimes flared without warning. But unlike most men of his era, Murphy spoke openly about his struggles. He urged the government to do more for veterans carrying invisible wounds, becoming a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. In this, Murphy proved that his service did not end on the battlefield. Whether through film, books, or advocacy, he continued to fight, this time for recognition and dignity for his fellow veterans. And that, perhaps, was his greatest role of all. Not just the hero who fought the war, but the man who refused to let its survivors be forgotten. By the late 1950s, Audie Murphy was more than just a decorated soldier who had stumbled into Hollywood. He had become a paradox, a man burdened by nightmares yet beloved on the silver screen, a reluctant celebrity who carried the weight of both triumph and tragedy. Magazine covers and radio programs made him a household name, but behind the polished images was someone far more complex, far less at ease with fame. Hollywood, with all its glamour, could never fully claim him. He stood apart from its self-congratulation, uncomfortable in tuxedos, restless at banquets, and skeptical of those who lived for applause. He often said he was just a soldier who survived, a reminder that his identity was never fully swallowed by the industry that surrounded him. Audiences admired him because he seemed different from other stars, unpolished, yes, but real. On screen, he carried an authenticity that critics struggled to categorize. When Murphy played a gunfighter, his quiet intensity suggested a man who had truly seen death. When he looked away in silence, viewers sensed the shadows of memory. He could not fake it, and that was his power. But Hollywood is a world built on pretense, and not everyone welcomed a figure who stripped away illusions. Beneath the parties and premieres, tension brewed. Murphy's blunt honesty, the same quality that had served him on the battlefield, often unsettled the carefully constructed egos of Hollywood royalty. It was in this atmosphere that his path crossed with one of the era's biggest icons, James Cagney. For Murphy, who rarely spoke harshly of colleagues, his reaction to Cagney was startling. He despised him. Friends recalled how bluntly he put it, "I couldn't stand him." Cagney, to the public, was untouchable, a New York street kid turned screen legend, famous for his swagger and tough guy roles. But to Murphy, the act felt hollow. He played the same man in every picture, this he once remarked. Maybe the public bought it. I didn't. Murphy saw in Cagney not toughness, but artifice. The gulf widened when Murphy thought about the war. While he bled in Europe and buried comrades under foreign soil, Cagney stayed home. To Murphy, who measured men by where they stood when the world was burning, that absence was unforgivable. The whispers of the 1940s that Cagney's politics flirted with dangerous sympathies, though never proven, only deepened the mistrust. There was also the personal sting. In smoky Hollywood lounges and glittering parties, Cagney sometimes referred to Murphy as Soldier Boy. To some, it might have been playful. To Murphy, it was venom. "I didn't mind being called a soldier," he said later. That's what I was. But the way he said it, that told me everything I needed to know. Murphy's bitterness was not jealousy. He admired other stars, especially those who had worn a uniform. James Stewart, the Air Force pilot turned actor, he revered for his humility and grace. But Cagney? Murphy called him a man who was always acting, even off-screen. Maybe there wasn't a real man there at all. Over time, dislike hardened into hatred. In interviews, Murphy deflected questions with curt replies. In private, he was harsher. I hated him more than anyone in Hollywood. He was everything false about the business. For a man who preferred loyalty and silence over gossip, the vehemence was extraordinary. And yet, the reasons remained wrapped in shadows. Was it simply arrogance? Was it politics? Or was it something deeper? Something unspoken that Murphy carried to his grave? Friends close to him never fully knew, only that the animosity was real and unrelenting. In a city built on facades, his hatred of Cagney stood out like a crack in the stage lights, raw and unexplainable. But life, with its cruel symmetry, had a final act waiting. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander on a business trip. Hours later, the plane slammed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia. He was just 45 years old. The official cause? Poor weather, low visibility, pilot error. Straightforward, simple, tragic. Yet from the beginning, the story refused to settle. Why had the plane descended so dangerously low? Why did pilot testimonies contradict one another? And why did investigators quietly note that pieces of wreckage were missing? Questions circled like vultures. Never answered, never silenced. Rumors spread. Some whispered of enemies in business, others of ties to organized crime. Still others hinted at something darker. That Murphy had seen or learned things in his Hollywood and Washington connections that made him inconvenient. A man who had survived German artillery might have fallen victim not to fog and mountains, but to secrets too dangerous to keep alive. Decades later, independent investigators reopened the case, armed with modern forensics and declassified files. Their findings only deepened the shadows. Certain wires appeared cut, control systems tampered with. Retired officials spoke at last of classified operations and whispered warnings that Murphy had known too much. The implications were staggering. Had Audie Murphy, who stood unbroken against enemy fire, been betrayed in peacetime? Was his death a cruel accident of weather, or a silencing carefully staged to look like one? No one could prove it. No one could disprove it. All that remained was the mystery, casting its long shadow over a life already larger than legend. Audie Murphy's story doesn't fade with the credits. It settles in your chest. Courage, sacrifice, and the shadows a man carries home. He stood small, fought giant, spoke plain. Now it's your turn. If you want more truth over gloss, tap like, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who remembers what honor feels like. And tell me in the comments, who should we dive into next? James Stewart? Alvin York? Someone you served with? Someone history forgot? Drop a name below. I'm listening.